It was March 8th, International Women's Day, and in a small town in northern Spain, spring was just beginning to appear. The cold winter air could still be felt, but the first flowers were beginning to sprout timidly in the gardens. For many, this day was a celebration full of flowers, smiles, and gratitude. But for Laura, this March 8th would be different. Laura lived in an old house, inherited from her grandmother, on the outskirts of town, near a dense forest. She had always felt a special kind of connection to that house. The stone walls, the sloping roof and the old wooden beams reminded her of the years she had spent there as a child, listening to her grandmother's stories by the fireplace. But that afternoon, as the sun began to hide behind the trees, something changed. As she passed the mirror hanging in the entryway, Laura saw something that made her pause. In the reflection, for a brief moment, a shadow crossed behind her. She turned her head quickly, but there was no one there. Her heart began to beat faster. She approached the mirror, but everything looked normal. "It must be my imagination," she said to herself, trying to calm herself. However, the uneasy feeling would not go away. That night, her friends Elena and Carmen arrived to celebrate together. It was a tradition among them to get together on March 8th, share anecdotes and laugh about past memories. Everything seemed to go smoothly. The wine flowed, laughter filled the room, but Laura could not get the shadow she had seen in the mirror out of her mind. As the night wore on and the conversations deepened, the atmosphere in the house began to feel different. A cold draft swept through the living room, causing the candles to flicker. Carmen, sitting by the window, frowned. "Have you noticed that it's colder than usual?" she asked, rubbing her arms. "Maybe it's the chimney, I should put more wood in it," Laura answered, trying to sound calm. She got up and went to get more firewood from the shed in the backyard. As she opened the front door, the icy wind hit her in the face. She walked quickly toward the shed, but something stopped her halfway. From among the trees of the forest, a tall, dark figure seemed to emerge. It was still, motionless, as if watching her. Laura's heart began to pound, and fear gripped her. She didn't want to approach, but her feet seemed nailed to the ground. The figure did not move, but the silence was deafening. Only the wind rustled the branches of the trees. Laura took a step backward, then another, until she was able to turn and run toward the house. As she slammed the door shut, her friends looked at her with concern. "What's wrong with you?" Elena asked, noticing the fear on Laura's face. Laura tried to explain what she had seen, but the words stuck in her throat. "Maybe it's my imagination, maybe the wine is affecting me," she thought. However, she couldn't help but glance sideways at the mirror in the doorway. The night continued, but the restlessness did not leave Laura. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the living room window. The three women looked at each other, startled. "What was that?" murmured Carmen, getting up slowly. The knock was repeated, this time louder, as if someone or something was trying to get in. Elena went to the window and looked out, but saw only the darkness of the garden. "There is no one," she said, but her voice sounded doubtful. At that moment, all the lights in the house suddenly went out, plunging them into total darkness. Only the faint rays of the moon coming through the windows dimly illuminated the living room. The silence was absolute. Laura felt the air in the house grow colder, as if something invisible was draining the heat from the room. Suddenly, the mirror in the entryway crackled. The three women turned toward it at the same time. The mirror, which had always been fixed to the wall, began to move slowly, as if an invisible force was pushing it. Then, suddenly, it fell and shattered into 1,000 pieces. Carmen screamed, backing away immediately. Elena turned on the flashlight of her cell phone, illuminating the chaos on the floor. But before they could react, a soft, barely audible whisper filled the air. "Get out of here." The three of them froze, fear searing through their hearts. The whisper came from nowhere in particular. It seemed to be everywhere. A muffled sound, like a moan, echoed from the back of the house, coming from the dark hallway. "We are not alone," Elena whispered. As she slowly backed away, Laura felt a wave of terror invade her. She tried to calm down, taking a deep breath, but she knew something was terribly wrong. Something or someone was with them in that house, and it wasn't friendly. "We have to go," Laura said quietly, trying to stay calm. But just at that moment, the front door slammed shut, as if an invisible force had blocked it. Elena and Carmen screamed in unison. Laura ran to the door, trying to open it, but it was sealed shut from the outside. Something dark and malevolent was trapping them inside that house. And the more time passed, the more intense the manifestations became. The wind outside began to howl, and the shadows inside the house seemed to move on their own. Laura struggled to open the door, but it was useless. The air inside the house felt thick, heavy, as if something invisible was pressing down on them. Elena, still with the cell phone light trembling in her hands, began to cry silently. Carmen, standing by the window, was desperately looking for a way out. "This can't be happening," Carmen murmured, looking out into the garden. Outside, the moon barely illuminated the landscape, but everything seemed darker than usual, as if the shadows were spreading, getting closer. Laura, trying to stay calm, turned to her friends. "We can't stay here, we have to find another way out." "Maybe the back door." The three of them began to move cautiously towards the kitchen, where the other door leading to the backyard was located. Each step echoed on the wooden floor, the creaking amplified the terrifying silence that surrounded them. Just as they reached the kitchen, a sharp, piercing sound made them stop in their tracks. It was like the scrape of fingernails against glass. Slowly, Laura looked up at the small window over the sink, and what she saw made her heart stop for a moment. There, on the other side of the glass, a dark, faceless figure stood still, watching them. It didn't move, but its presence was disturbing enough to make Laura instinctively recoil. Carmen let out a gasp and Elena clung to her arm. "What is that?" Elena shouted, her voice cracking with fear. "I don't know, but we have to get out now," answered Laura, panic starting to take hold of her. She ran to the back door and tried to open it, but just like the main door, it was locked, as if something was keeping it closed from the outside. Every time Laura pulled the handle, she felt an unknown force resisting. The lights on Elena's cell phone flickered for a second, then, without warning, went out, plunging them back into darkness. Only the pale glow of the moon streamed in through the windows, barely illuminating the figures of the three women. The whispering, which had been barely audible before, grew louder this time. There were no clear words, but it was a sound that made the skin crawl, a presence that seemed to come from all directions. "We have to hide," Carmen said quietly, barely managing to contain the tremor in her voice. Laura, with no other choice, nodded. She knew they couldn't get out of the house, at least not through the doors. They had to buy time, wait for something to change. The three of them moved quickly toward the basement, where they knew they could lock themselves in, though the thought of descending into an even darker, more confined place terrified them. The basement was small, barely enough space to store some old boxes and tools. Upon entering, Laura turned on a small flashlight she had found in the kitchen. The light was dim, but enough to see the surroundings. They closed the door behind them and pushed an old wooden shelf against it, hoping that would give them some security. The cold was more intense in the basement, and the silence became crushing. Only the gasping breaths of the three of them could be heard. Time seemed to stretch, every second felt like an eternity. "What do you think is happening, Laura?" Elena asked, sitting on the floor with her hands shaking. I don't know, but this is not normal. There is something in this house. Something that doesn't want us to leave. Do you think it's a spirit? Carmen looked at Laura with panicked eyes. Laura thought of the stories her grandmother used to tell her when she was a child. Stories about trapped souls, vengeful ghosts, and entities that wandered between this world and the next. She had never given them much thought, but now, in the midst of the darkness and with what she had seen, those stories seemed more real than ever. My grandmother always said that this town had secrets, things that should never be disturbed. Laura said, her voice barely audible, and you think that's what's going on? Carmen asked, grasping for any explanation. Before Laura could answer, a sharp knock echoed from the basement door. All three of them startled, their bodies immediately tensing. Another knock, louder this time, rattled the bookshelf. Something was trying to get in. It can't be, Elena whispered, moving closer to Laura. The knocking became more frequent, as if the force on the other side of the door was determined to break it. The bookcase creaked under the pressure, and they knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. The silence was even more terrifying than the noise. None of them dared to move or even breathe hard. Laura raised the flashlight, illuminating the basement door. The bookshelf was still in place, but everything was in an eerie state of stillness. Before they could relax, however, a soft, chilling laugh filled the air. It was not human. It was something else, something ancient and evil. The laughter echoed in their heads, as if coming from inside their minds. Do you hear it? Carmen whispered, hugging her knees, as tears ran down her cheeks. Laura did not answer. She knew they were not alone, but she had no idea how to deal with whatever it was that stalked them. All they could do was wait, and pray that morning would come before it was too late. But then, the lantern lights began to flicker, and the cold intensified. Laura felt a presence behind her, something approaching, that was so close she could almost feel its icy breath on the back of her neck. She slowly turned her head, her heart in her throat, and what she saw made her scream. There, in the gloom, a dark, distorted figure stood, silently watching them. The figure in the gloom was tall and dark, but its contours were undefined. It looked like a living shadow, distorted and elongated, with almost imperceptible movements that emanated an unsettling presence. Laura felt her heart pounding, echoing in her ears. She could not look away from that entity, even though every fiber of her being was screaming at her to flee. What do you see? Elena asked in a whisper, while trying not to lose control. I don't know. Something is here with us, answered Laura with a trembling voice. The figure remained motionless, but an overwhelming feeling of oppression filled the air. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching them, waiting for their next move. Suddenly, the sound of slow, heavy footsteps began to echo through the basement. There was no one else there, but the echoing footsteps filled the space, getting closer and closer. Carmen, trembling, tried to remain silent, but the panic was evident in her accelerated breathing. I don't want to die here, Carmen murmured, barely managing to hold back tears. Laura knew they had to do something. They couldn't stay in the basement waiting for that thing, whatever it was, to get them. Her mind worked frantically, searching for a solution. There's a small window at the end of the basement, Laura said quietly, trying to come up with a plan. If we can open it, maybe we can get out of here. Elena nodded quickly, clinging to any hope of escape. The three of them moved silently toward the window, located in the farthest part of the basement. It was small and almost flush with the floor, covered by an old metal grate. Laura directed the light of the flashlight towards the window, but noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. Outside, on the ground, the shadows were not behaving as they should. They were not simple reflections of their surroundings. They were shadows that moved, that seemed to stretch towards them, as if they were trying to catch them. Laura felt a shiver run down her back. "We can't go out this way," she whispered, her voice broken by fear. Elena and Carmen looked at her in confusion. "Why not?" Carmen asked desperately. "Outside, there is something." "The shadows, they are not normal." Silence reigned again in the basement, but it was not a quiet silence. It was heavy, laden with tension. The echo of footsteps still echoed, though there was no sign that anyone else was there with them. It was as if the house itself was playing with her senses, making reality and terror blend together. Suddenly, the basement door, which they had blocked with the bookcase, began to shake violently. Something was trying to get in. The three women instinctively backed away, and Laura, without thinking, turned off the flashlight, plunging the place into total darkness. "What do we do now?" Elena asked, her voice breaking with fear. Laura took a deep breath, trying to calm her mind. She knew that the only way out of this situation was to keep a cool head, but terror was beginning to take hold of her. "We have to hide, somewhere where they can't find us," she said, although she wasn't even sure what they were. They moved slowly towards the other end of the basement, looking for a corner where the shadows could not reach them. Laura could feel her breathing getting faster, but she tried to control it. She knew that if she lost control, they would be lost. Suddenly, a high-pitched, piercing scream filled the air, causing all three of them to freeze. It wasn't coming from any of them. It was an inhuman sound, full of pain and fury, echoing throughout the basement. The door shook once more, and then, all at once, the bookcase blocking it fell to the floor with a deafening clang. Something had come in. Laura turned her head quickly, but she couldn't see anything in the darkness. She could only feel the presence approaching, like a palpable shadow creeping toward them. "Run!" she shouted, pushing her friends toward the far corner of the basement. They ran for the corner, but the space was small, confined. There was no way out. They were trapped. Laura turned on the flashlight once more, but what she saw made her heart stop. The dark figure that had been watching them earlier was now only a few feet away from them, motionless but unsettling. It had no face, but the darkness around it seemed to absorb everything around it. The shadows on the walls seemed to move in rhythm, stretching towards the three women. Laura knew there was no escape now. They were trapped with that thing. But just as she was about to give in to panic, an idea crossed her mind. "My grandmother, she always talked about an amulet that she kept in this house," Laura murmured, while her thoughts were racing. "She said it protected him from the spirits." Elena and Carmen looked at her with despair. "Where is he?" Carmen asked, clinging to hope. Laura closed her eyes for a moment, trying to remember. She knew her grandmother had mentioned the amulet on more than one occasion, but she had never paid attention to it. Where had she kept it? Suddenly, she remembered. "It's in the trunk in the corner of the basement. That's where she used to keep her most precious things." Without wasting any time, the three of them went to the old trunk, covered with dust and cobwebs. Laura opened it with trembling hands, frantically searching through the old objects inside. Finally, she found a small leather pouch, and inside it, a silver amulet with inscriptions she couldn't read. He held it up, not knowing if it would really work, but it was his only hope. The dark figure kept approaching, but when Laura lifted the amulet, something changed. The darkness enveloping the figure seemed to waver for a moment, as if the amulet had weakened its power. "It works!" Carmen shouted, relieved, but before they could celebrate, the figure let out a piercing scream and rushed at them. Faster than before. Laura held the amulet with all her strength, and just as the darkness was about to envelop them completely, an intense light emanated from the object. illuminating the entire basement. The figure stopped dead in its tracks, and then, with a final scream of fury, vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the echo of its evil laugh. The three women fell to the floor, exhausted and trembling. The house was silent, and for the first time in hours, the air no longer felt oppressive. Laura looked at the amulet in her hands, grateful that she remembered her grandmother's words. But she also knew that something deeper and darker lurked in that house. Although they had survived that night, she felt the story was not over. March 8th would never be the same for them.